Dopamine swipe, dopamine swipe. Followers, likes, double tap. Now they control your life, Dopamine swipe.
What's up, everyone? Welcome back to another episode of the 817 podcast. It has been a great fall weekend in Fort Worth. Really enjoying this weather. What have you been up to over the past week, EJ?
A lot of work. Just got back from Washington, D.C. Presented at a conference. It went well. And, coming back with a lot of updates. I'm part of Leadership Fort Worth, so I had my leadership class last week, November 4th, which that was a really good time. Really excited to get into it. I know the TCU had a big win.
Yeah.
How's that feel? Post GP?
You know, Baylor understands their place, and they made sure that they stayed in it, I guess. But yeah, that was a pretty big thing this week that TCU and head football coach Gary Patterson cut ties. Gary's been the coach for over 2 decades, and really has seen TCU grow alongside Fort Worth's growth. I think the Star-Telegram article had some really great numbers. In 2000, when Gary took over, TCU had 5,000 applications to get into school, and is now receiving about 20,000 a year. Their endowment was at $937 million in May 2020, and now stands at $2.1 billion. It's an interesting strategy to build up a school via a football program. But as a Fort Worth icon, I feel like we would be remiss if we didn't mention that happening this week. And it'll be really interesting to see where TCU goes next as far as football coach. And also see, Gary's from Kansas, but he's pretty entrenched into Fort Worth now. Him and Leon have their organization that does work for Fort Worth. And I don't know, maybe we'll see them out and about around town a little bit more now that his weeks and weekends are free.
You talk about being at the Rose Bowl.
Yeah.
And getting applications from California.
Yeah, we talked last week about the number of students from California that come to TCU, especially in relation to the perceived amount of people moving from California to North Texas right now, and maybe what relationship there is there. It really he's had a huge impact, not only on the school, but also on the city over the last 20 years.
Yeah. Well, I know we're going to have a couple short stories here, and really the big story is the election results from from voting last week. But we're first going to hit a couple things, right? Obviously, TCU football is big to Jimmy as an alum, and something else that's big for both of us is just journalism as a whole. And so this next story is just kind of giving updates of the current landscape of journalism in Texas, really with the Star-Telegram and just kind of what we have to be thoughtful for as we look for insightful journalism. Jimmy, you caught this story before I did, and so I would love to kind of get your takes on what two sides of the coin that you're going to present to everyone.
Yeah, so there were 2 stories that came out this week in relation to the Star-Telegram, one of them coming from their own point of view, and the other coming from Columbia Journalism Review, and the Star-Telegram's parent company. So McClatchy, which owns the Star-Telegram, owns an obscene number of news outlets in the U.S., has declined future Report for America participation following that organization's critiques of hedge funds dictating news and funding news in the way that they do McClatchy. So over the last, multiple decades, quote unquote, news has been dying. Local papers have been shut down, staffs have been shrinking, journalists have been stretched thinner and thinner as they try to cover local news, hold local officials accountable, and keep people informed. One organization, Report for America, essentially subsidizes reporters joining local newsrooms. So McClatchy, it was part of working with that organization. 31 Report for America journalists work across 21 McClatchy newsrooms. Their designated areas of coverage include everything from housing to gun violence, communities of color, COVID-19. And one of the leaders of that organization came and spoke out recently about the negative impact of hedge funds on local news. And so McClatchy is saying that they are going to opt out of working with that organization moving forward, which means that the Star-Telegram is going to be losing, as of now, it looks like their environmental reporter and an Arlington reporter. And so, I mean, that's just a pretty big bummer for us staying informed, that these are gaps in coverage that McClatchy is kind of choosing to no longer provide for us. But then the flip side of that is front page of this Sunday's paper, a new plan for the Sunday paper and what that may look like. So they're announcing that the Star-Telegram beginning November 14th is going to be reimagining what the Sunday paper is and how it can better serve readers. What that means is that recently Star-Telegram took a survey of what people wanted to be reading about, which has its flaws in general, right? Like there's definitely selection bias in asking a group of people who are most likely your most dedicated readers what they want to know more about, right? Like, You're kind of pigeonholing what you are going to serve up instead of potentially searching elsewhere for what would draw you to the Star-Telegram. So what that really came down to most are pretty broad: local government, education, stories that hold our public institutions and officials accountable. They plan to add 6 pages to the typical Sunday newspaper with more news and commentary, roundups of the week's big stories, and also have a page to highlight the work of their philanthropically funded Crossroads Lab team. More content about health and homes, and more online content. So QR codes in the paper that will open doors to interactive maps, graphics, videos, photo galleries. So that's, to me, a pretty cool thing that, like, they're trying to take the next step in being relevant to a wider range of audience. Honestly, if their mobile app is any indication of how the QR codes are going to work, I remain skeptical for now. But I appreciate that they're taking that step. All of this to say, local journalism is incredibly important, and I'm excited that the Star-Telegram sees that they need to take a step into, like, staying relevant. But I also find it very disappointing that their parent company is choosing to no longer accept help and funding for journalists for newsrooms that really need it.
Yeah. No, and I think it's also an opportune time for people like Fort Worth Report, who have a different model, being a nonprofit organization and really relying more on community support, but then also any government, federal dollars that are going to be around supporting journalism as local journalism continues to be impacted. I mean, McClatchy owns 30 local newspapers that influence 1.6 million readers. And so, that's a lot of influence. And I think, it's hard to see how to get because I just think we have to look at it as the responsibility. How do you get young people to read real news and even understand that there's a difference between journalism and media? And so when you just double down on the people that are currently funding you, I think this is a missed opportunity to see what do we got to do to connect. I think the QR code thing is really cool. I think like if you can make it more interactive, but also just make stories that are more relevant to young people as well.
Yeah, and I think both of these stories kind of show more and more of a selective bias in what they're going to choose to report, right? Like, you're potentially taking away a couple reporters that are more in fringe areas and need extra funding, theoretically, to be viable. Mm-hmm. And then, as well, you're taking a survey from people who read your newspaper, who would actually take the time to respond to a survey, to like keep feeding them more and more of what they're already getting. And so that's a maybe not great path to keep walking down. And something that just hit me with the QR codes is like, that's for print readers. And I wonder if that's a first step to try and get print readers to be more comfortable reading the news on their phone.
Yeah.
And like continue to phase more and more of print readers out. Because if you start showing them, hey, we can give you so much more stuff and like even better quality content online.
That's true.
You start to like go down the rabbit hole of not having print anymore.
Yeah.
So it's a really interesting thing that's coming. Also want to mention that donations to the Fort Worth Report will be matched through, I believe it's the end of the year. So if you have thought about donating to Fort Worth Report or becoming a regular donator, there's an organization that's matching funding to them for the next couple of months.
Yeah, love it. Well, those are kind of our two short stories up front, and then we're going to now move into updates on redistricting.
Yeah, so there was a redistricting meeting this past week amongst the city council, and want to give an update on some dates. So Friday, November 12th, that is this coming Friday at 5 p.m., is the deadline for residents to submit their proposed maps. Which, if you're unaware, residents through an online program can create and submit their own redistricting maps. It's and then those maps are then considered by the city council and the redistricting council. We don't really know how heavily considered, but somebody will see them. Then Wednesday, November 17th at 1 p.m., the staff briefs the task force about proposed maps prepared by residents, city council, and staff, and the redistricting task force evaluates these maps with respect to adopted criteria. Thursday, December 2nd, task force meets if necessary to complete that evaluation. Wednesday, December 8th, 6 p.m., City Council Chamber. This is probably one of the most important dates and times. So that's Wednesday, December 8th, 6 p.m. The task force conducts public hearing on proposed maps. So this is your opportunity to have evaluated the maps and for your voice to be heard. And then Friday, December 10th, 2 days later at 2 p.m., the task force discusses proposed maps and selects their initial map for city council consideration. So this past week, there were a few maps that they were looking at. It was a combination of maps from Carrie Moon and Jared Williams. And then they also flashed 3 maps from residents that met the minimum criteria for redistricting. So this is obviously a big thing that we've talked about a good amount recently, and will continue to cover for a while, because we're adding 2 districts, so adding 2 city council seats, going to be shuffling potentially the districts of current city council members to try and meet how Fort Worth looks now. I know you got some further perspective from your leadership Fort Worth class this week.
Yeah, we had the redistricting crew and team at the leadership class to get kind of we all created accounts and participated in drawing maps for an hour, and really just learned a lot. And redistricting just seems to be such. There's so much work to do, and I feel like should be such more of a priority for all of us. As more I learned about the process. I mean, one, I have empathy to the process in the sense of it's really hard to figure out how to give more seats to the urban core when it just goes so high up, and there's so much kicker to, you have to manage the population because every district can only have like 5. You can only have 5% less or 5% more than the average. So if we're about, that'd be like 91,000 people per district.
Yeah.
And so when you look at the growth and you look at how high Fort Worth goes, we saw in the paper on a different story around the new library in the west side, a lady quoted saying that 60% of Fort Worthians live out of the loop. So working on these maps, you start thinking, man, like, You might even be the minority if you're in the loop, as the majority are outside of the loop. And that really then wakes you up. But the really big kicker, too, is just like all these different criterias that play in. And one criteria that really hit my kind of got my ears perked was around community interest groups and how people from the city could apply to be a community interest group. And so what that means is, if there's a group of people who want to be together, let's say, Riverside was a big one that was being argued and them wanting to stay together. And that was a big conversation. But let's say there's just like a couple HOAs or a couple country clubs or a couple churches or a couple, it's really vague. Like just neighbors who want to be together in districting can go apply to be a community interest group. And the kicker to be a viable district map, you have to keep 50% of these community groups intact.
Right.
So I think there's only a couple dozen of these community interest groups who got submitted. I don't know what percentage got rejected. It didn't feel like a lot based off the presentation, but the kicker there is that the Gina Bivens area is one massive community interest group that really was like that forces you have to make that its own district. And the same thing kind of happened in the Northwest side as well. And so, I just started thinking around this community interest stuff and how does it work? And it just really, for me, showed that we need to have more conversations on what qualifies that and how, who wrote these groups. Did they talk to their city members? Did they talk to the community? Did we vote for it? Because it seems so lackadaisical, and that if you just have a nice title and maybe you're a part of an organization, that they will legitimize you as a group. And then you have to respect these groups. And I kind of said during the presentation, I raised my hand. I said, this kind of feels like selective packing. And, like you're allowing the community to pack themselves. And so now this East Side group, which is now all one district, which could have been better off if they would have been separated to maybe provide more representation. So those were kind of like these big highlighted points where I was like, man, we need to have more discussions about these community interest groups and how does one happen. So that's a big take. And if anyone knows more information about that, I'm reaching out to Michelle, who's the communication person there, to see more what qualifies community interest groups. But it just seems like a really sneaky way to keep people together and also make people decide for themselves to be together rather than communities to pack the city council people to pack people.
Yeah. And it just furthers this idea that this redistricting should not have been left up to people with vested interests in this deciding, right? Like we were recommended to use an independent redistricting task force. We have ignored that a number of times, and the ship has kind of sailed on that. But yeah, like one example that you were talking about before we started recording was like, you're in Central Meadowbrook. Let's say you were the head of the neighborhood association. Could you go to the neighborhood association head of White Lake Hills without neither of you talking to any of your people and say, hey, do you want to join forces and like apply to be a community interest group? And like, then you apply, like, because, you know, there's like legitimacy to what you're saying. So then like, where's the next step of that? Do you say, hey, there's a city council person there's a person I would like to get elected to city council. Do you think me and you can work together to get them elected, and we apply together as a community interest group so that like we control the voting block of who's electing them, right? Like, I think I'm not like trying to outwardly say that like this is happening already, but it's pretty easy to see the path to which that happens, right?
Yeah.
Like, it's pretty easy to see where there's potential corruption there.
Yeah.
So it's like, yeah, like you said, like, this is something we would love more information about. It's one of those things that's hidden behind a veil, as a lot of Fort Worth politics tends to be, that we're trying to like unpack and figure out.
Yeah, I want to know, what are the requirements? What was the vetting process? What is the percentage you accepted? What was the amount that came in?
And this didn't go through, like, this is never, I haven't seen this come up at a city council meeting, so it's not like they're, you know, coming together and the councilors all voting on them. Maybe it could happen in executive session and we don't hear about it. I don't know. But exactly, like,
Gina
this is
Bivens'
something we need
entire
clarity.
group is pretty much a community interest group.
Right.
Based off of and you have to keep community interest groups together when you start working on the software. So then what happens is they just become one district. So it's just like, but then it's positioned as, oh, they're all similar demographics and socioeconomic, and they want to be together. So when they vote, everyone's more aligned on getting the things that they want.
Which is a good thing.
But the idea there, though, is you only really need to be like 60% representation to get those votes, rather than 95% representation. But now with these community groups, if they are big enough, that means they'll be that large of the majority of votes in that city council. When how powerful is if Gina Bivens' group would have been broken up, where it was 70% stayed in her district and the other 30% went to Carrie Moon's district or went to another district, you know, around there. So it's like you kind of could be in a better position to get more done in the city if you saw that way. But you have to be very involved like we are to see the full picture and like have the time to see these kind of things, to even bring it up. I mean, we, in our class, we have 50 people there who have full-time jobs, who are leaders in Fort Worth. And we were starting like to look at each other like, whoa, what's the rules on this community interest group stuff? And so it's just like, and when you're busy, you don't have the time, the space. We had to sit down and listen to a presentation, and that's when we started deciding these things. And even the team and the people there were like looking at us like, kind of like, we need to look at this. So anyways, I know we talked a lot about the redistricting stuff, but be involved. November 12th, we'll put the software training stuff in there if you're interested in getting into the software. It is difficult, but it's a good idea to just kind of at least play with it and see what's going on. But let's go ahead and move into the big story.
Yeah.
Which is the election results for both the school board and the state ballot as well.
Yeah, so all 8 state amendments passed. None of them were particularly close, which is what you expect, right? Like, majority caucus in the Texas House and Senate create these amendments, and then the majority in Texas votes to uphold those amendments, or to have those go through. So not really a surprise at all about the 8 Texas state amendments. But let's talk about Tarrant County and Fort Worth ISD. Tarrant County approved the $400 million bond for road expansion by about a 2-to-1 margin, and voted against the $110 million for building a district attorney's office by about like 55 to 45. So 43,000 votes for, 53,000 votes against. So Prop A, $400 million roads, approved. Prop B, $110 million district attorney's office, denied. And then more significantly, Fort Worth ISD. So came down to 42 votes, but Prop A, which was about $900 million to redo all the middle schools in Fort Worth ISD, passed by 42 votes. And the other 3 props all did not pass. It's the first time in 22 years that Fort Worth ISD bonds have not passed. And honestly, I was just really sad on Tuesday as I started to see vote tallies start to roll in. And really quickly, it was evident that the B, C, and D, that those 3 were not going to pass. Prop A is still, I guess, technically up in the air because it was so close. They're doing a recount. We have no indication that it should change in any way, shape, or form, but the decision on that is still outstanding. And I think that there's a lot of places to look on, like, what went wrong, what stories need to be told. But fingers crossed that still passes as the big chunk of the money that we were wanting to spend on Fort Worth ISD.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking. What's the number of total? We're looking at 12,300 against, 12,342 for, a $1.2 billion bond. That is a total of 24,642 people in a 910,000 population city, who then voted to decide on a $1.2 billion, people. I can't express how small of a number that is and how influential voting in your local elections, when they're not near as exciting as Biden and Trump, as they're not near exciting as Beto and Abbott, these things that we're not voting for impacts our future. Because the biggest kicker, too, is we just talked about redistricting and how 60% of people live out of the loop that are part of Fort Worth. And a lot of these middle schools and elementary schools that were going to get renovated are in the loop. And so, you know, it's just a shame because when we talk about the reason why we're losing companies is because of talent and because having a robust workforce that can fill those jobs is the reason why we're losing companies. And then the place to answer that is education, and then you don't invest into it. You know, that's...
And we're talking about trying to preach, like, y'all means all, and, like, this city is here for everyone, but then we don't fund predominantly black and brown students having equitable education opportunities. I mean, I think that there's obviously after any election, like, there's finger pointing, etc. And there were flaws in the way that Fort Worth ISD, that the way the school board went about this, right? Like, there wasn't enough public comment. There wasn't enough time to get the messaging out about it. Like, we reached out to school board members and, like, couldn't get anybody to come on the show to just, like, talk about their thoughts and explain what all these were. Like, there was not enough messaging around it. But also, like, I think that anytime there was a news article about these bonds, which wasn't super frequently, especially from the Star Telegram until, like, the day of, there was also the, like, any article that included talking about what the bonds were for included a quote at the end that said something like, people against the bonds say that there's declining enrollment in Fort Worth ISD, and that's why we shouldn't be investing more money in. But nobody is continuing to write the story of where are the white people going?
Yeah.
Like, where are these people going? Why are they leaving? Like, let's continue to ask the questions and try and tell the story of where are these people going and what can we do to make Fort Worth ISD more attractive to people with the ability to charter, private, homeschool, etc. Because it's insane that our like population statistics have like a 35% difference with the demographics of our ISD, right? Like that's
the median age for America is under 40 and just 60% of the country identifies as white. Those who vote in the average of the 2018-2014 midterms as a guide, 75% of voters will be white and their median age next year will be 53.
Yeah, well, and even when we break down like Fort Worth is like about 45% white, right?
Yeah.
Fort Worth ISD is like 10 to 12% white.
Yeah.
Like that's a massive gap that we need to start asking the questions and exploring and diving into why that is, so that when bonds like these come across, like the people voting, I understand why these don't pass. The people voting don't have a vested interest in Fort Worth ISD. So why to them is it worth investing money in? Like, I see the logic train of why you would vote against it, even if I disagree with it. So now we need to start asking the question of why is this happening and what can we do to fix it? I would say one thing to do to fix it would be to invest the money into these schools to make it so that people with privilege want to continue having their kids in them. And then I just think, too, of, like, Carrie Moon's soccer stadium idea that, like, seems to, you know, have some momentum behind it and some support. Like, that's going to benefit Keller ISD. Mm-hmm. That's probably not going to get... we'll have to see what kind of pushback it gets. But we could have used these bonds to build Fort Worth stadiums. Like, that's what we just voted against. Are these same people going to vote for Carrie building a stadium? Like, it wasn't about the stadium. It was about who is getting the stadiums. And so I think that we're just setting ourselves up for more and more disparity and more flight from Fort Worth ISD.
Yeah, and I shared that statistic earlier with the idea of I bet our separation between voting and average age in Fort Worth and the percentage that were white voters is way larger than that national, you know, where it was what the average was 53 and 75% white. I mean,
yeah, which isn't a like number that we have access to right now.
Yeah, but I bet, locally, I bet it's, you know, what was the average age? Probably pushing 55, you know, average.
Yeah.
You know, so it's, who knows, but we'll see. And I think, you know, a couple things I also just kind of want to hit. I might not even keep this depending on if it makes any sense. This is statistics from an Economist article I read this week, in the new Economist article around social. And I'll put the article in the description because the Economist does allow for a couple free reads a month for people. That it was talking about the social spending packages and cannot repair the American dream. And so I just saw some data points that I felt like were interesting, and it showed that if you consider the chance for a child born to parents in the bottom fifth of the income distribution, chance to make it in the top fifth of income. In a society where origins did not matter, one would expect the likelihood of such rag to riches story to be close to random chance, right? 20%. In America, the chance is just 7.5%. Comparisons with other countries make this look particularly concerning. The land of opportunity is badly outpaced by European welfare states such as Britain, France, and Sweden, where the chance is above 11%. Intergenerational disadvantages are stark for Black Americans. They have only half as good as a chance of escaping from the bottom fifth as poor whites do. 1 in 5 Black Americans is from a family which has been mirrored in the bottom fifth of income distributions for 3 generations. For whites, it's just 1 in 100. So we talk about, inequality. And, the article continues to go down how in September, the Census Bureau reported that the typical income for white households in 2020 was 61% higher than for black households, a gap which has barely changed since 1967 when the data series began. When I look and I hear that you make 61% more than black households, well, that impacts schools. Mm-hmm. Right? That impacts schools. Mm-hmm. Helping people get from the bottom 20 percentile to truly live the rags to riches story to the top to the top 20 percentile. Schools are going to do that. And if we don't see that full picture and we want to be the American dream and we say we're the American dream, that doesn't seem like that's actually fair.
I think that for a growing city that wants to be known as like a place where talented people are and are moving, like we have to invest from the ground up. And it's not a long-term decision to not be investing in that. I used a double negative there, but it's a short-term decision to not be investing in our kids and in our future. And so just really sad to me that for the first time in 22 years, we made a regressive decision when it comes to school board bonds.
Yeah, yeah. And I just think a lot of what the problem is, though, is that it's just like the idea that success is individualized off of hard work.
Right.
And people think that success comes from hard work. And I think that's the middle class hijack that the top 1% has from us. I mean, the article continued to kind of go on how since 1989, which when I was born, the Federal Reserve has put out quarterly data on distribution of national wealth. Its most recent release for the second quarter of 2021 showed for the first time that the top 1% of earners held more wealth than the middle 60%. The data from the Congressional Budget Office showed that the share of national income taken home by the middle 60% of earners in America has fallen, and taken by the top 20% of earners has risen. In 1979, the middle 60%, the majority of us who probably went out and vote, took home 50.8% after taxes and transfers. In 2018, that share has fallen to 45%, and the top 20% has gone up to 49% of take wealth in America. So it's like we have this idea that it's even impacting ourselves. It's not just So it's this idea of like, oh, we're doing it. It's just, and like we are able to do this and succeed. It's actually still not true. You're working harder. You're still losing out on assets compared to others because the dominance of the top 1%.
Right.
So it's
that's reflected in the way minimum wage hasn't increased. Not even just like saying in relation to inflation, but in relation to productivity, like we're not even close. It hasn't increased in relation to CEO pay, like all over the place. We're just looking at inequality that, people are doing a really good job of messaging that you're doing okay, when in fact you are not. Like, you're not going to be the lottery ticket. You're not going to, and maybe that's super pessimistic of me to say, but I think it's pretty realistic. Like, I understand that I'm never going to be a billionaire. I'm quite content with the fact, and I'm pretty happy about the fact that I'm never going to be a billionaire. But the fact that that is still message that we need to protect the wealth of those people in the lottery ticket chance that you become one of them. Yeah. It's a bizarre, it's a truly amazing that that messaging is worked.
And here, and it's such a great article. And again, I would put it in the description. It says, an economist at the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago calculates that if an American father made twice as much as his neighbor's father, he would be expected to make 60% more than his neighbor. That is much higher than if they were French, 41%, German, 32%, or Danish, 15%. So, though less than if they were Brazilian, 70%. So, not only, let's say 2 households and your household makes twice as much as the household next to you, you are expected to make 60% more than that kid who's coming from that next generation.
Yeah.
And so then that's where you feel like, oh, I outpaced my dad and mom. I worked hard. Why can't that kid? And so it's a great article around how all of this plays together, but we are getting have this facade around we are working hard to get to our success, which hard work is a part of the game. But we're not seeing all this intergenerational things that play into hand of how stark it is to get out of poverty for people of color.
Yeah. And we're more comparable to what we see, or what is like portrayed as one of the more corrupt governments in the Western Hemisphere, then we're not comparable to social democracies. I feel like we ended up going down a little bit of a rabbit trail there, but I think it's a good conversation for us to be having and for us to think about in the bigger picture of not investing in schools. But are you ready to move into wins and losses?
Yes, let's make it happen.
So my loss is a big loss. Fort Worth ISD trustee Daphne Brookins passed this week due to complications with COVID. And I mean, it was just I think the Fort Worth Report article is a really great tribute to her. She joined the board in 2019 to fill a vacant seat and then was elected to a full term this year, leaves behind 2 sons. And it was just a servant-hearted person who really served our community. And so those of you that knew her well, we're really sorry for your loss, and we're sorry for Fort Worth to lose someone who has chosen to spend a lot of their time and energy giving back to the community. So that was something that hit early or later this week that was a big loss for the community.
Absolutely. And something she was an advocate for was a Tatiana Jefferson. And that's, and what happened there. And so to me, that kind of goes into my loss about how the trial for Aaron Dean may be delayed, which we've been patiently waiting. Well, not patiently waiting, having to wait for a long time for. The trial was supposed to be scheduled for November 16th. However, there's other cases and the docket is stacked. So they're talking about how there was a total of 205 cases that are also for November 16th. So that means that due to the docket list being so large, that this could be pushed back, with the earliest being November 29th. But if you have a pessimistic view, that could not be the case. Maddie Parker went out and shared her testament, saying that we have to get this on the docket, have to get this going. So if this trial for Aaron Dean goes back, that's my loss. The fact that we're even just having this discussion. I will hold as well as that I'm going to have another. It's kind of a loss, but it's more prediction. But I'm going to hold it for at the end of the show. For all of you who've been so great to be on so long.
Sounds good. Yeah, I mean, I agree. Like, this is quote unquote competing with other things that have been pushed back, but this has been delayed for a couple years now. Like, just because we finally pushed to get it on a docket a couple months ago doesn't mean that it's already been delayed for so long. So yeah, I mean, it's got to happen. Like, there's no excuses for this to continue to be pushed back.
Absolutely.
My win is that the Amon Carter Museum of American Art has announced that it will be the first ever major museum to present a survey of contemporary indigenous photography. So they announced Thursday that the exhibit Speaking with Light, Contemporary Indigenous Photography will run from October 30th, 2022 to January 22nd, 2023. It will highlight nearly 100 works by more than 30 indigenous artists over the past 3 decades. I think, this is super cool. I'm really excited. I was like, when they announced it and it was like, oh, it's a year from now, I was like, oh man, that feels like that's a bummer that I'm learning about this and have a year to wait for it. But this is super cool. Awesome that Eamon Carter is taking the first step out to make this happen. Really excited for the people behind this that are putting this together, and I'm really hopeful for like the crowd and turnout that this starts to bring.
Yeah, and as always, Fort Worth has great museums and people like this. That why this is such a great city. So I think that's sweet, and yeah, it sucks that we have to have the wait.
Yeah, November is Indigenous Peoples Month, and so it will, starting on October 30th next year, we'll obviously have a big chunk of time in running all through November. So I'm really hopeful for how this honors these artists and continues the conversation. Especially last week, we talked about the Juneteenth Museum and construction, like the potential for that. It's really cool to see our minority communities be represented well, start to be represented well in the city.
My win goes to scientific innovation in Fort Worth and the Metroplex as a whole, but a local COVID-19 research group gets FDA approval to start clinical trials. A group of doctors worked together, which was led by Dr. Satyamurthy, a cardiologist in Fort Worth, who started thinking about ways to help the life-threatening response to COVID-19 by thinking through how to prevent the multiple failures of organs that happen to some COVID-19 hospitalized patients. So he was exploring what drugs that can calm the body's immune response and prevent the storms from happening in people's organs. And after a year and 6 months, 40 Zoom meetings, 5 in-depth proposals, in September, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration approved the group's research for clinical trials. They say it's the first time in the city's history a working group of clinicians and scientists have come together to arrive at this endpoint in Fort Worth and the Metroplex. And so it's just showing how Fort Worth is a hotbed of true innovation in this space. And we just should celebrate that, as this is right here in our backyard. Work is happening that can impact the world. So kudos to everyone. There was doctors and facilitators from JPS, Baylor Scott and White, TCU, UNT Health Science Center. So really cool article in the Fort Worth Report. Shout out to everyone working hard to save lives and continue to innovate to make the world a better place.
Yeah, that's awesome. I'm excited to see how that industry continues to grow in the city.
All right, so going to the prediction here, where I think is a loss, but I'm going to predict here on the show, Jimmy. And what's cool about it, if I get it wrong, I never have to predict anything again on the show. If I get it right, you guys are going to want more of this, and I don't know if we'll have anything else for you. So, but I think this is the kicker, and I think it comes with Rivian. I just believe that we have or will lose Rivian. That Rivian will not come to Fort Worth. That's the prediction here. And the basics there around my prediction is just reading other news around the electric grid. I mean, you have a great take on that I was cracking up earlier about, which I'll let you say to everyone. But I think the reason why I say this is because Ford picked Tennessee for its new electric vehicle plant. And Ford is a partner to Rivian. And so I just feel that would make a strategic sense to go to Tennessee. So my prediction here on the 817 pod is that we do not get Rivian, and they actually will more likely go to Tennessee.
Yeah, which if you haven't been with us for a while, Rivian is an electric motor company that is picking a new headquarters for its vehicle development. Fort Worth is seen to be heavily in the mix for it, and it would be a massive boom to the local economy, as well as just being a hub for a super
12,000 jobs.
Yeah, 12,000 jobs, like really well paying, and just like the center for a massive technological advancement. And yeah, I mean, I wouldn't move my company to Texas given the electrical grid, right?
Especially electric vehicle.
Right. Like there's no indication that what happened in February is going to change anytime soon. And like that could be a massive setback for your company. So amongst that and all of the heavy political stances that have been taken in Texas recently, like if I were a company, I would not move here. And so I'd agree with you that they'll probably follow forward to Tennessee, which we're facing the consequences of our actions, and I can't blame anybody for that. Well, thanks for sticking with us. Thanks for listening. We hope to have some interesting conversations coming up in the next few weeks. Enjoy this beautiful fall weather that we have, and we'll talk to you next week.
Take care.
Swipe, dopamine, swipe. Follow us, likes, double tap. Now they control your life, Dopamine swipe, swipe. Follow us, like, double tap. Now they control your life,